My guest today is a Syrian-American journalist who has recently returned to the United States after covering the Middle East for over 10 years. She also corresponded for several media outlets, including the Reuters Opinion, Washington correspondent for Arab Weekly, Public Radio International, BBC Radio The World. Rasha Elias, welcome to Middle East with NASCA.
Thank you for having me.
Let's just start with your story. Can you just sum up your story in a couple of minutes, like how you started, and you are Syrian, why you got involved in those kind of projects?
Well, I was born in Syria, but I wasn't raised there. I was raised in the region in the Middle East, and then I came here to the States as a teenager, and actually didn't pursue journalism at first. I was in finance and banking and all that world, and then, like so many others and so many journalists, actually, it was the attacks of 9/11 that sort of made me question the meaning of my work in finance and wanting to just do something more meaningful. And I wanted to travel back to the Middle East, and I felt compelled to do that because I speak the language and I'm familiar with it. And I wanted to be among those who tell the stories. So that's basically how.
And I know we were just talking before the interview started. You were telling me less than a year ago you were in Syria. Could you tell us about your experience? Because Syria is not a country that many people can visit. How was it last time you were inside the country, and how was it for you?
The last time I was there, I was mostly in government-run Damascus and government-run Homs, and also along the coast. And I also witnessed the return of some part of Homs exchanging hands from the rebels to the regime. The general atmosphere, in those parts of Syria, it depends on who you ask. Obviously not everyone in regime-run Damascus supports the regime, and not everyone opposes it. You get the impression, I mean, if you want to speak, relatively speaking, it is safest to be in those parts, like in the central part of Damascus and some parts of Homs, and certainly along the coast. However, people there constantly can hear the warplanes and the helicopters, buzzing the skies above on their way to the rebel areas, to bomb those areas. And it's very disconcerting. I mean, if you're high enough, if you go up to a roof in central Damascus, you can sometimes see government helicopter flying overhead, going to a suburb, which normally, before the war, would have been, say, a 15-minute drive from central Damascus, but now you see the government helicopter flying there, tilting to an angle, shooting down, and then tilting back and flying overhead back to its base. And you're just, I mean, wow. And if you're a journalist, you go online and you check the activists' pages, and you see who just got killed. You basically will have witnessed the entire killing operation of rebels, and very often civilians, sometimes entire families. It's very, very difficult to witness.
Rasha, when we look inside Syria, or from the pictures, the videos we get inside Syria, that we sometimes, especially among the rebels, we cannot differentiate who's who. And I'm just wondering, you can explain to our viewers that if you are inside Syria, how do different groups recognize and differentiate among themselves? What's the way, because so much going on there.
Yeah, there is so much going on. I mean, now 5 years into the conflict, you have so many different hands in the pot. You have Saudi-supported, Qatar-supported rebels. You have, obviously Iran sending in mercenaries hired by the Syrian regime, and they can be often of course, they're Lebanese militia from Hezbollah, but oftentimes they're also Iraqi Shia, or even from Afghanistan, or even just I don't know, random mercenaries hired. And this is all before the Russians got involved. And of course, you have the rebels that are supported by the U.S. through Jordan or, whatever, some other ally. So, and then of course you have ISIS and you have the Al Qaeda affiliate, Jabhat al-Nusra. So it is very difficult. I mean, there's a lot of infighting every now and then. The rebels on the ground recognize that there is some strength and unity, so they decide to unite. But there's so many competing interests with basically sometimes they're between their patrons and sometimes with a conflict on the ground. There's now a war economy, don't forget, with warlords that are trying to control territory and smuggling routes of weapons and food. So, that's the tragedy. The longer this has continued, the more complicated and tragic it has become, and it just continues to be like that.
I know the Geneva peace talks ended just recently, and UN envoy urged Obama, also Putin, to intervene in Syrian peace talks. As at the same time, we hear news of bombing hitting hospitals inside Syria, and doctors and rescue workers, Doctors Without Border, and civilians been killed in the recent news. What's going on in Syria? Is involvement of Obama and also Russia, is it beneficial for Syrian crisis?
Well, to be honest, I think most Syrians, regardless of where they fall on the spectrum of how they feel about the regime or the uprising, they will tell you that, if only the foreign hands would just get out of Syria, the Syrians can try to resolve this on their own without foreign intervention. And certainly the intervention that's happening now has not been helpful at all. I mean, certainly the Russians have carried out airstrikes that have killed thousands or at least hundreds of civilians. They've also they've paved the way for Syrian regime troops to advance onto Aleppo, resulting in what we're seeing now. It was somewhat hopeful when Moscow sort of took the lead on championing diplomacy with the Geneva talks and all that, but the truce has faltered, and right now it's just really, really tragic because all these different parties that are involved, they have competing interests. So I'm not sure. It's very difficult to identify in whose interest is it to bring a timely and speedy resolution to this violent conflict. I mean, maybe some of the parties involved are not interested in that. It's actually beneficial to continue this.
Yes, and you mentioned competing interest, and we want to talk about the regional powers in the area, which been criticized a lot. For example, Saudi Arabia, Turkey. While Saudi Arabia is supporting certain groups inside Syria and Turkey, and of course there's Iran involved and many other countries. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, let's face it, I don't think, certainly Saudi Arabia is not the sort of the champion in the region for human rights or democracy, and a lot of people will tell you certainly that's not what Saudi Arabia is after, and that they're not pushing to help establish that in Syria, and certainly they don't want that in their own backyard. Bahrain, for example, is a good example of that, where Saudi Arabia quelched any sign of dissent there very, very quickly. So, on the other hand, you have Iran, and Iran seems to be only interested in maintaining its what it perceives as its sort of hegemonic influence on Syria, just because this is, they perceive it as their territory, not the territory of the Saudis. This is the tragedy of being in a region with these two superpowers that are, or regional powers anyway, that are not, they don't seem concerned at all with the plight of regular Syrians. And then you have the superpowers, the bigger powers, the US and Russia, and they're so far removed from it. Maybe Russia now realizes that ISIS can come back to bite them at some point. The US, I think feels a little bit removed from both the refugee crisis and ISIS threat. So I don't know what to tell you. It just seems that the question is who has a pressing motivation to resolve this, and it seems no one. Maybe Turkey. I mean, Turkey is very much affected by this with the refugee overflow. But everyone else is sort of, they can afford for this to continue to go on. Mm-hmm. Unlike for Syrians really can't afford for this to continue. They've lost so much.
Let's talk about the peace process a little bit more and what's going on, because the UN envoy Staffan de Mistura recently during peace talks in Geneva said that there's no plan B for Syria. If there's no plan B, what do you think what's going to happen? And what do you think about the peace process in general? I know it has been failed in general.
Yeah, this idea of diplomatic solution versus military solution, I think toward the beginning of the conflict, we used to hear some people pushing for a military solution that from their perspective anyway, they thought it might be possible to push the regime out militarily. But I think now most people have come to the realization that a military solution is just a bad idea. It's just signing up for much more bloodshed, that the best way forward right now is diplomatic solution. But first and foremost, there has to be some protection for civilians, some immediate protection for civilians. And that would have to happen with humanitarian corridors, maybe a no-fly zone or whatever, but some areas where civilians feel protected, where they can start to sort of some semblance of civil life, some semblance of regular school routine and regular medical help and other humanitarian help, where they can start to maybe farm their land again, or start up an economy that's not so embedded in the war economy. And then once that happens, then the opposition and the regime can, start talking. I mean, the opposition wants all detainees to be released right away, sometimes as a precondition to the talks. But whatever that may be, without sort of an immediate attention to the well-being and safety and humanitarian needs of civilians, it's very difficult to move forward on diplomacy. And frankly, if you ask me, diplomacy at this stage may very well be the only way forward. There is no plan B.
Russia, some say that the only way to move forward in Syria is to defeat ISIS. In your opinion, who can defeat ISIS?
Well, I mean, I actually remember when I was there in Syria and ISIS came to be, and I was shocked because it felt like it was overnight, or just in a matter of hours, or certainly a matter of days, that ISIS managed to take over 1/3 of Syria, 1/3 of Iraq. And I remember people on the ground in Syria, in those areas that are still today under the occupation of ISIS, and I was in touch with them by Skype or online, and they were shocked as well. I mean, they said, how could the West allow this to happen? I mean, how did the West just sit by and allow ISIS to swallow up so much of Iraq and so much of Syria? We never thought the West would allow this to happen. And so my question is, it's just so ridiculous that the entire world just sort of seemed to have stood by and watched ISIS expand and then entrench itself. And, and now ISIS has become sort of the lightning rod of the conversation on Syria. It wasn't so just 2 years ago. So back to your question, who can defeat ISIS? I mean, ISIS can't entrench itself without some sort of base locally, wherever it happens to be. So when it expanded into eastern Syria, the Deir ez-Zor area, they basically made alliances with the tribes through a mix of bribes and financial incentives and also pure terror. Beheading a tribe, beheading 700 men from a tribe that didn't give their allegiance to ISIS. So through all these tactics, they managed to sort of entrench themselves in those areas. But without the local support, or at least local cowering, ISIS just can't grow roots anywhere. And I'll tell you, I mean, everywhere I've gone in Syria, including the rebel-run areas, including areas where people actually supported the Al-Qaeda affiliate Jabhat al-Nusra, including those people, they hate ISIS, absolutely hate ISIS. They consider it foreign. They view the jihadists, the Western jihadists that join ISIS, with utter contempt. And in fact, it's a lot of the time the foreign jihadists that join ISIS.
Rasha, you mentioned that all those groups hate ISIS. Obviously, the Bashar al-Assad's government keeps saying they are targeting ISIS, Russia targeting ISIS, United States targeting ISIS. Why all those forces not united then? What's the problem if they all have common enemy?
Well, no, I mean, look, reality is Assad forces have not been targeting ISIS. I don't think anyone says they are, except maybe for themselves. And we also know that the Russian airstrikes also have not been targeting ISIS, that instead they've targeted rebel-run areas and paved the way for the regime to recapture some of the rebel areas. They did target ISIS a little bit here and there, and certainly with Palmyra, and that helped the sort of fall of Palmyra from ISIS hands. But the only sort of united front we see against ISIS is the U.S.-led coalition, and even that has somewhat faltered. The Gulf allies, Saudi Arabia and the UAE, which I think for a hot minute, and Jordan, for just a hot minute, they also joined in the airstrikes against ISIS. They quickly stopped. I mean, Saudi Arabia is busy with its own war in Yemen, and Jordan, I think, lost heart after their pilot was burned alive, and if you recall that incident. And let's face it, there was also a lot of pushback domestically that, why are we sending our warplanes to bomb other Muslims? Because that's also a big question. Is ISIS Muslim? I mean, you're going to get different answers from different people.
Yeah, it's a whole show about Islamist, jihadist, ISIS, if ISIS is Muslim and all of that. Maybe next time we can talk about that, because seems like it's a confusing topic. There's so many opinions on that. I want to talk about, obviously, the really important topic when you mentioned Syrian refugee crisis, and it's getting worse and worse. About 4 million Syrians are refugees. About 6 million are displaced within Syria, half are children. What's next for those people?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. And now we're, spring coming on summer, and in the summertime, more people are willing to take the risk to make the dangerous journey across the Mediterranean into Europe. And as Europe is finding out very quickly that it's almost impossible to hermetically seal their borders, even with these new policies they have with Turkey that they're going to return the migrants or refugees to Turkey. Even that has not been deterring people from making the journey. So, you have to keep in mind a lot of the people that end up spilling over into Europe very often have been, refugees in some of the other countries already, like Lebanon or Jordan or even Turkey. And I'll give you classic examples. They realize, oh, wow, my Syrian passport is about to expire. I can't renew it because I'm wanted by the Syrian regime. I can't they believe they can't enter a Syrian embassy, or they don't have access to a Syrian embassy. And they figure, okay, well, once my passport expired, I'm going to be totally persona non grata here meaning, say, Lebanon. And so where am I going to go? I can't go back to Syria. And here I have my family, 5 children, a wife, in-laws, and grandpa, and all that. We're just going to, whatever money they can pull together, sometimes whatever they pull is enough to smuggle one of their family members out. Sometimes it's, more. And they'll go. They'll take the risk, babies and grandparents and all. And then you hear the other sort of the other side from Europe being overwhelmed and complaining and all this. I don't know what Europe expects. This conflict geographically is right next to them, and it's been going on for 5 years. And unfortunately, we haven't seen any sort of political or diplomatic leadership from Europe to help resolve the refugee crisis at its base. Most Syrians would much rather stay home if it's safe. Just if somehow there can be some solution to guarantee the safety of civilians with humanitarian corridors and like civilian no-fly zones or whatever, that would really, really take the pressure off the refugee crisis that Europe is complaining about so much.
Yeah, we're talking about Syrian children. Obviously, it's hard not to talk about. Most of those children, even if they're inside Syria, they're not going to school. Between 2 million and 3 million Syrian children are not attending school. That's according to UN Children's Agency that recently reported. I mean, I know you're talking about chaos and children don't have food to eat, but I know they're the future of Syria. How the war in Syria affecting those children, and what's going to happen if they're the future of the country?
Yeah, I mean, the only glimmer of hope that I can think of is when I look at other conflicts around the world and how they survived the war. I mean, how did Europe survive World War II? Children weren't attending school for months and years at a time there as well, and they were malnourished, and Europe managed to pull through. So, somehow the human spirit, I think, and perseverance, and the fact that already so many of the adult population in Syria is literate, they're not going to want their children to be less literate than they are. That's at least a good sign. At least it's my own personal hope. But that said, and yes, of course, it's a big problem for the children who are in refugee camps and unregistered and don't have access to UN services or local services in Lebanon or Jordan or Turkey. They're the children who live in rebel-held areas, and this comes back to my point of establishing humanitarian corridors. When the airstrikes stop, even as the airstrikes continue, a lot of the rebel-held areas have been self-administering their territory with some money from Syrian expats or European NGOs or whatever. But they have been, they have kept schools open. Very often the schools operate in basements of buildings. They try to convince parents to send their children to these schools despite the airstrikes and what have you. They have, with whatever meager resources they have, they also have psychosocial programs for children. They have some awareness programs against recruiting children into becoming soldiers, against forcing young girls into marriage, and so on. So it's really amazing the extent of this kind of work that goes on in rebel-held areas, even when there are airstrikes. And when the airstrikes stop, their work begins to blossom. So, so again, this brings us back to the point, just if the airstrikes can stop, then civil society on the ground can just have a breather and can really do more of the work that they're already doing so much of, despite the ongoing violence. It's amazing.
I hope that the airstrikes will stop soon. But I also want to end each episode with some sort of feeling of hope. And do you have hopes for Syria, or are you hopeful about the future of Syria?
Yes, I mean, of course, without hope, we might as well jump out the window. Yeah, of course, I'm very hopeful. I just hope the resolution comes sooner rather than later, because the longer we wait, the more bloodshed, the more people displaced, the more heritage sites destroyed, the more communities completely obliterated. So, yes, I very much hope Syrians can sort of get to a place where everybody can just move forward and start rebuilding the country. I hope that comes soon.
Rasha Elias, thank you so much and good luck with all your work.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me.
Thank you.